Evening, everybody. Welcome to session 2 of For the Beauty of the Earth. Before I get started with anything, I just want to let you all know that this session is being recorded. So if you have any issues with being visible on screen, this will be made public eventually. So just please feel free to let me know, send me an email if you have any concerns about that. I'll put my email in the chat for you. All right. So my name is Nicole Litwiller. My pronouns are she, her. If you're not familiar with pronouns, just a quick note about that. We often make assumptions about a person's gender, and often those assumptions are incorrect. And so using people's correct pronouns are a way of showing respect. So if you'd like, you are welcome to hover over your little video box and click on the 3 dots, the 3 blue dots in the corner there, and you can select rename. And if you'd like to add your pronouns to the end of your name, you're welcome to do that for our time together this evening. I am the Climate and Racial Justice Program Coordinator with the Center for Sustainable Climate Solutions. So I'm the person that you've been receiving emails from and updates from for this event. And like I said, I'm so excited to see all of your faces here this evening. I know we have people joining from all over the place, so it's wonderful to be together. A couple of things about Zoom etiquette, just a couple of reminders. Please try to keep yourself muted while we have a speaker sharing. That just helps to limit interruptions, keep us all focused and that kind of thing. The mute button is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. If you'd like to, there are a couple of viewing options on Zoom. If you go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen, you can click view and you have the gallery view, which allows you to see everybody's wonderful faces if you'd like to do that. Or you can select speaker view, which focuses on the person who's speaking. Lastly, while Nidhi is sharing this evening, if you have any questions that come to mind that you'd like for her to answer during the Q&A time, you're welcome to type those into the chat. I'll be keeping track of those and facilitating the Q&A time. So you can type those in the chat as they come to mind for you. So like I said, we are in session 2 of the webinar series for the beauty of the Earth. And in this webinar series, we are exploring the intersections between climate and racial justice. So these issues are, I've come to learn, not only interconnected, but inseparable issues. And so I'm hoping that through this series, we can all continue to learn about those intersections. And I recognize that in this series, we won't be able to get to everything because really the connections are endless, but hopefully through this series, we'll be inspired to continue learning about these intersections and exploring the ways that these issues are connected, and also be able to meet some new folks who we can build relationships with to tackle these issues together, because it's always better to do this with other people with more minds. So the format for this evening, we will be first hearing from Nidhi, and then following that, like I said, we'll have a time for Q&A. And then after that, if you'd like to stick around for a time of smaller breakout rooms, you'll be in a room with about 4 people or so. And that's just a time for us to be able to really start connecting together, making these things that Nidhi is sharing with us, start applying them to our personal lives, thinking about how they impact us personally, and just reflect with other people and get to know a couple of other folks too. So that will be the series of events for this evening. And before I introduce Nidhi, I'm going to take some time and invite us into a time of prayer. I'll be reading the same prayer that I read last week for those of you who are here. And this is a prayer that has been adapted by Carol Penner. And while I read this, I invite you, if you'd like to close your eyes, if that feels comfortable for you, you're welcome to do that. You can mute your video screen if you'd like. But I'd really just encourage us all to notice the emotions that come up while I read this prayer, and don't judge them, don't try to push them away, just notice what arises, and it may be similar things as last week, might be different things. So just really try and let yourself be as I read this prayer. Creator God, hear our prayer for settlers everywhere, for people living on land stolen and traded unfairly from Indigenous peoples. You know our cruelties, our violent erasure of cultures and histories, our cavalier dismissal of treaty rights, our personal prejudices, our institutional racism, our defensive disinterest. We are part of a colonial system so insidious, those who benefit refuse to see it, even when it's in front of our faces. You are a God who names, a God who hears. You know the name of every missing and murdered Indigenous woman. You hear the cries of every child separated from their family. You know the original names of every mountain, river, and blooming flower. You hear the earth groaning as she is torn and broken, her holy balance polluted and poisoned, and yet she continues to give. Breathe into us your winds of disruption, your great spirit, an imagination that breaks cycles of domination by rearranging landscapes, upsetting tables where money is counted, and emerging in new patterns, embodying your radical love. Creator God, give us the courage to seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with you toward the liberation of Earth and all of her beings. Amen. Thank you all for joining me in that time. I'd like to now go into, as we did last week, a time for us to acknowledge the people who were on this land before we arrived and who may still be on this land. And we are all joining from various parts of the US, maybe even some people from around the world. So I'd like to invite us to, if you know the names of the Indigenous people who originally inhabited or continue to live on the land that you are joining this Zoom call from, you're welcome to type those names into the chat here in this Zoom call. And if you don't know the names of those people, this is an opportunity and an invitation to do some research and learn about the Indigenous people who were on this land before, and many of whom remain on this land and continue to face forces of erasure and destruction. So we'll take a few minutes or just a minute or so to type these names into the chat. Thank you, and feel free to continue adding those names if you'd like. And also, if you want to copy and paste some of those and save them for future research, you're welcome to do that. It's like an ongoing learning opportunity here. So tonight we are going to be hearing from Niddy Vanode. Niddy is a very cool person, and I'm super excited that she is going to share with us tonight. I've had the opportunity to get to know Niddy a little bit over the past couple of years, but I'm excited to learn from her this evening. So Niddy is a social justice activist, and she studies plants as a research assistant at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. Having grown up in Bangalore, India, and having independently moved to the US, she identifies with the struggles faced by people seeking freedom of thought, work, speech, and life. Coming in with this background, she is exploring concepts of the intersection between plants and movement of people vulnerable to climate change. She seeks to further explore this topic through conversations with people about the future of borders, social justice, and climate change. So please join me in welcoming Niddy this evening.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Nicole, for this wonderful opportunity for different speakers to have this platform to present and connect across borders, right, which is the topic of my presentation today. And I also want to welcome a special guest, my sister, who's joining us from India. And it's 6:30 a.m. there, and she has chosen to be with us today, and that is wonderful. I also want to thank you all for being here because it is 8 p.m., 8:13 p.m., and you have chosen to listen to me about borders and climate change and movement of people. So thank you. I will start my presentation by sharing my screen. It works. Can you all see my screen? Can someone give me a thumbs up or? Okay, great. All right, thank you. So I'm going to talk about movement of people and climate change today, climate justice today. And I was thinking about an introduction to start this with. I will start with a short introduction and then move on to the agenda of what I'm going to cover today. But before I move on to the agenda, I wanted to give you a short introduction. And I couldn't think of a better way to introduce this concept than to present the art of Ricardo Morales, who's an undergraduate student at UC Santa Barbara. In this beautiful picture, what Ricardo has done is amazing. Ricardo's art is an adaptation of a Japanese painting called The Great Wave by Katsushika Hokusai. Katsushika, in his painting, in the old painting, represents the wave as an irresistible force of nature threatening humankind. What Ricardo has done here is used that thought frame to illustrate the big wave as climate change. But the wave and climate change is more than just a force of nature. You see people on the right, people of color, Indigenous, they seem like they come from farming communities with plants in the foreground and the background. And what they're saying is loud and clear and in between. They're saying environmental justice is our cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions that threaten to submerge our homes. I'm going to return to this painting at the end of my presentation to give you more deeper context, but I want you to observe here a couple of things: the gestures by people, the wave, the belongings that are floating, and the word toxins. And I will get back to this image after the whole presentation. Okay, moving on to today's agenda. These are the topics that I'm going to cover. First is global movement of people. Why are people moving into North America or developed countries? What is the reason? What are the reasons? I will connect it to the historic movement of Mennonite people, to my own history or my own story, present story of movement, and then connect this to global justice and the migration pattern that we're seeing, which we call third wave of migration. And moving forward with that, what can we do as individuals is something I'm going to talk about. And then we will discuss more about it in breakout rooms. Also, another thing I'm going to be doing tonight is I'm going to be sharing the art of many undergrad and high school students who raise their voice and share their lessons through art. The person on the right, well, it's not a person, art on the right is not by an undergrad or high school student, but much older person, Miem. But I wanted to share this because Miem does a really good job over here connecting her childhood memories of what it was like to move from Korea to Hawaii, and expresses this in the form of soft pastel colors, and discussing how the fragmentation of her childhood movement comes together in the form of art here. So for generations and for centuries, we have seen that humans have moved widely from country to country, within regions, right? My family moved from one state to another, and we see this common pattern across all humankind and even animals and plants, right? And over here, you can particularly focus on the left, where there are regions where people are moving into the US, and there are also regions people moving into Europe and also close by countries. In these figures, what we understand is that people are moving not because of just some random reason, but because they all desire to live a life of dignity and freedom. This picture here was posted in Science Journal and talks about migration of people. Moving in a little closer, you also see that people from North America are moving towards Europe, but then people from around the world are moving into the first world, what we call developed countries, right? And in the next slide, I discuss a little more about why is this? Why are we moving? What have been the reasons to move, and what continue to be the reasons to move? And some of the points that are presented, which are limited, but some points presented here are to the left. You see a push because of which people move, such as persecution, violence, war, poor wages, lack of jobs, crop failure, pollution, natural disaster, limited opportunities, lack of services, and family separation. A large number of people are moving into developed countries where life appears to be possible and more stable, and that is the pull side of the reasons. I also want to note that there is forced migration that has happened in the form of slave trade, and also bringing in immigrants as farmers into the countries that are more developed, which is unfortunately not described here, but grateful to be able to present that. Through our own history, I say our own because I'm married to Perry Maddox, whose mother's side of the family is Mennonite, have come from a Mennonite background and have been able to move from religious persecution into the US. And this was possible and much essential and needed and crucial, right? To be able to move at the time of this violence into a place of stability. And for many people, this was not possible, but for others, this was an opportunity. And we recognize that this was much more of a possibility than what it is today. From my interactions with Perry's family, I have learned some common themes between my family and their family, which is hugely farming. Perry's family and many Mennonites have interacted with the land for generations, right? You have farmed and taught your children to farm and taught about the connection of land and what this meant to so many people is a form of stability to be able to be free in practicing these practices. Over here, Perry's grandfather is picking beans, and I have spent time with his mother and his father learning about how wonderful it was to be able to run around freely in an open space and to breathe fresh air. Through this history, or an earlier period of people migrating, I connect to my own story of movement. I moved from India, Bangalore, which is where I grew up, to the United States because of family difficulties and social difficulties, and mostly because I really wanted to study plants, and that was not possible in India with the discrimination between women and men and the job opportunities that were available to us. So I moved to the US alone, and soon I realized that the racialized justice at JMU made me feel alone, more alone than what I was in the United States. And I wanted to leave. I wanted to scream. I didn't know what to do except to leave for a temporary time because I also had a broken back. So I traveled to all the countries in Central America and some parts of Asia where I was able to learn from people that were in those lands. What I learned in some of these lands was that, just like our families, people were much entangled with their environment and with farming, and work and private life was not as much of a separation as we see to be the case in our present countries, and sometimes which is spreading because of capitalism, but I'll get back to that a little later. So during my travels, what I also observed was this confusion, right? A confusion of there being more rain or oil spills, there being just more pests all of a sudden, or this change in rhythm and change in patterns. And at the time, because I had not completed my undergrad, I didn't know what was going on except this wide term that we know today as climate change. But to study this further, I came back to the United States and to also study plants. I went to EMU and learned a lot more about these concepts and learned about the history of these concepts. At the time when I was in my undergrad, what I also learned was this hard truth that the country that I was studying in, or Virginia, had stopped recycling and previously had sent a lot of the recyclables to China and to other countries, or sometimes to Charlottesville to recycle the waste that we in the countries produced. And when recycling stopped and was no longer carried out, I started soil cycles with my friend Amelia, who's also here, to be able to show that with just bicycles and people, that you could move waste, that we can take care of our own waste. And through this process, we composted about 27,000 pounds of compostables, just as young individuals in a community. So we see that there are solutions. They aren't problems as much as we make them to be problems. But what I also learned when we first introduced the concept of soil cycles to the larger public was that a friend from Cuba commented saying, "How wonderful that you can think about your environment when my people, where I come from, we are unable to feed ourselves, and that how wonderful that this is not a problem for you and you can care about something other than yourself," right? And to some extent, that is a very much of a reality and a contribution to climate change. In this figure graph, we see that extreme poverty in the world is also in places that experience stress through having to provide for countries. Things like coffee, cheap fabric, wholesale food, and to be able to provide for other countries and themselves receive a lower wage than what people in developed countries make. Another truth to that reality is that climate change is going to affect the people in these places more than it's going to affect the people in developed countries. In this graph, you can see that the more browner regions are the places that are going to experience fewer mild days, so more extreme days compared to other countries. What we also see are the countries that are responsible for CO2 emissions are not the countries where you see poverty, as we had once upon a time learned. This could be true, but larger CO2 emissions, metric tons per capita, are emitted by the countries that we see here. On the flip side, extreme risk of CO2 is extreme risk of climate change is experienced by these most vulnerable places that have fewer resources and fewer abilities to be able to move to other places to find a job or to be able to move out of this difficult situation, right? So what are we seeing with all of these changes that are happening? What are we seeing is that the climate crisis is leading to a larger migration of people from their own lands. We see that the people that provide hugely for other countries and themselves, the people that are entangled with their lands, inseparable from work and life, are the ones that are having to flee with fewer resources. The hope and an ability to flee is continuously diminishing as there are more impacts of climate change. In the current research that I'm doing with the Smithsonian, I learn a little about the process of how climate change is not always heard to be drastic, even though that is the truth. And what I mean by that is that we often hear a story of climate change written in sudden events, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, which are to a huge extent true and definitely true. However, climate change also occurs at a smaller, slower pace, such as here, large trees suffering more during drought. And over here, for many people who are making their living in close relation to land, farming and foraging, it is experienced as small shifts that add up to undo a way of life. A few days of dry heat or a sudden downpour at the wrong time can make irreplaceable losses. This picture is from my partner who's studying in Western Panama. And some of his observations are that in July, quote, July has been a long, hungry month in agricultural cycle when staple harvests are low. But when rains are delayed, dry July extends until September. People end up scraping by on white rice and chicken feed until harvest can come again. And some of this I have observed in my own travels, where the way life works is through ebbs and flows in this particular village in Nicaragua. During a dry, hot afternoon, they're waiting to cool off and waiting for the tides to slowly rise so they can cross the water to harvest fish on the other side of the land. But what happens when these ebbs and flows, the cycles of agricultural periods and increased pests come into what was previously expected? We see that people have had to move and people continue to need to move, to be able to move. However, what we also see is that countries that are developed also have strict border laws, making it hard for some of these people to be able to freely move, right? A study published by Princeton shows that tighter border laws leave immigrants vulnerable to effects of climate change. As the planet continues to warm, people living in the world's most vulnerable regions, like arid or low-lying nations, must contend with the decision to stay in a place where livability is decreasing, or leave for countries with more stable climate and economic conditions, or leave for these countries, right? So what is happening? What do we do? And where do we really place the blame is something that I have struggled with as a single individual, right? So what can we do with this is a question that I continue to ask and many people around me continue to ask. But before I get into the question, I also want to address that climate change and justice is not entirely understood until we learn from people's stories. One of whose stories is from my grandmother's. From my grandmother's story, I've learned many things. But I asked her, Grandma, why did you decide that we should shift to a different way of making money than what we have done for 6 generations of living with plants and cropping and growing crops? And one of the things that she mentioned was the growing pressures from a nearby city, Bangalore, where prices become more expensive and the life that was earlier there was not possible anymore. And so the need to shift to a more modernized life is true and is needed in many cases, but that shift is also because of a larger entity of what we call capitalism. I'm not alone in saying that capitalism is part of the huge impact of climate change. And the irony over here is that Wired has a wonderful article about capitalism, but also has a flash sale, which is part of capitalism, right? But we go with it. It's not too expensive. So the wider problem is also capitalism, that you cannot separate from climate change, movement of people, and racism, which is a huge part of these series. In 1978, and even before, we have had scholars talking about how capitalism without racism is not really possible. And this article does a very good job explaining that. William Sales Jr. is a professor, I forgot at which university, but I read the article and I was really struck by the amount of information that connected across borders about how capitalism is one of the reasons for racism. We see this happening, the existence of capitalism affecting people within a country and outside a country. This picture, illustration, and photography is done by an undergraduate student as well. And she describes this artwork gives honor to Chinese immigrants who endured discrimination during the gold rush in California. So we see capitalism mostly affecting people of color, Indigenous people, in its own country and across the world, right? And we see a disproportional effect of not only capitalism, but also climate change and climate injustice affecting within a country and outside the borders. A poem by by Narlin Matos, who's my advisor at the Smithsonian's partner, describes some of this. And I thought that it connects to some of the concepts that I've talked about in terms of how movement of people, in terms of forced movement of people, was largely for yield and larger purposes of profit rather than intended move. I will read parts of this. It's shortened because I couldn't fit the whole poem, but I will read a little bit of the poem. Let me move the screen. Elegy to the New World by Narlin Matos. You ask me, my companion, where had I been during my long silence? I was in the sweetness of the sugarcane and in the bitterness of the sugarcane plantation, where the leaves trembled of fear of mankind. You asked me, my companion, where had I been during my long silence? I was in the merchant ships that traded my destiny to the Americas. You asked me, my companion, where had I been during my long silence? I was in Guatemala, I was in Yucatan province, I was in Cartagena de las Indias province, and in the great kingdom and great province of Peru, and in the new kingdom of Granada, and in the islands of Trinidad, and in the kingdom of Aztecs. You ask me, my companion, where had I been? Only I can break. Where had I been? And only now I can break my silence. I was with myself. Oh, sorry. So through this poem, some things that I take away are that the movement of people from place to place, forced migration, is largely based on capitalism and largely based on profit and largely based on what we are not as humankind, right? It has been taken, people have been taken from their lands forcefully, and now also through climate change. And throughout this whole time, in the last sentence, you see that the person had been silent throughout and now has had the chance to say. And that speaks to the next part of my presentation. How can we move forward? You might have questions of, what do we do with all of this information, with the overwhelming amount of knowledge that we're all getting? And then we also ask questions of, what do I do as an individual? One thing that I do want to say is that I'm sure most of you here know what to do, otherwise you would not be listening to this talk. And so I assume that you're all active politically. But one thing I can give from my side is my story and a connection of stories that touch upon the points that I have mentioned in the previous slides. Some of the answers to what do we do about people moving to this new land, about capitalism, about racism, about social injustice, climate injustice, I learned from my own grandmother in the stories that she tells, and I'm sure we can learn from our grandmothers about the stories they tell. But one thing that I learned was that when my grandmother was much younger, the land was shared in a way where there was less competition or no competition, that we cared deeply for our neighbors, we cared deeply for the people that are within our community. She said that when anyone came forward to ask for help, they were not returned without giving food or without giving connection or moving forward. And this speaks to a lot of our religious faiths, our beliefs, what we are as humankind. And what she also explained was that what we see as greed, what we see as ignorance manifests itself as as the Prakriti in Sanskrit, which is land, the nature, being angry at us, and thus giving it back through large floods and giving it back through these processes that we cannot sometimes make sense of, but we are continuing to make sense of. So I take some of that from my grandmother into my own story. In this picture, I look very happy in a very happy place, but the reality of it was that I was starving and I was alone. I was alone because when I came to the United States to do my undergrad, I didn't have any money and I didn't have any support from anywhere. The cards stacked against me were huge in terms of I was going to be deported if I didn't enroll into an education system. But when I enrolled into an education system, I didn't have loans or scholarships that were available because I was largely international. So here I had to end up paying huge amounts, the cost of $24,000, $24,000 for a year of education, all without having the resources to be able to do so. But I did it, and that's why I'm here. And I'm here to tell you the story that during that time, it was difficult, but more than difficult. I dreamt of food. I dreamt of refrigerators. I dreamt of being in a place where I could breathe. I was analyzed with seeing images, which was part of PTSD. And I thought I would never move forward. And moving to the next slide, the only reason I moved forward was because the people in this image said that, or through their actions, oh, it's jumping around, doesn't want to stay. Through their actions said that no matter what the political borders or what people want from you, from a larger institution of capitalism, we will be there for you. And just that commitment from all levels of my life, from my personal life, from my educational life, from my now moving into research life, made it possible that I could be alive and be speaking to you. From left to far down right, there is a person who helped me get through education, bought me a coat when I was going to school drenched every day because I didn't have a rain jacket. In the middle is my mother and sister who believed in me, but also grew up. My sister and I grew up without a father, and so it was difficult for my mother, but all she could give was determination and strength. To the right is the family that I'm married into, who have supported me through many times in my life, and down my friends, my advisors in the future that have made this journey possible. So through this, I ask myself and I talk to people that I know from different backgrounds of what is it that we want as people of color, as Indigenous folks, as people struggling to move forward. And one common answer is to be seen as human beings, to be in tune and intuitive within our sense of what it is like to be human, and to understand beyond competition and beyond our own busyness is what I think will truly move us forward. This is done by another undergraduate student, Jabin Sanchez. And I find some of these answers also in grocery stores. Recently, I was buying apples at a farmer's market, and I had been seeing people from Mexico selling these apples, and recently it shifted to them not being there. And so I asked the people, what happened to these friends that I would be talking to? And they said that, oh, they went back to their family. We paid for their flight ticket and they will come back and we cannot wait for them to come back. And talking a little further, I learned that people across borders are making greater connections because of being humans and not because of the border laws. And so these two groups of people across borders have helped each other to move through back and forth, to have a good wage, to have good income, to be able to reach the life of dignity and freedom that both of them are seeking. This illustration is by another high school student. Another illustration from Andrea Campos in Folsom High School, California, depicts a very important reality. And what she has explained are these speech bubbles of different languages, that we have people in bubbles of speaking Spanish, of being categorized as different people, of being from France up top right corner, and from the US, and having these Black backgrounds as being separated through these bubbles. But she explains that the more languages you learn, the more groups of people you unlock, and the more people you learn from. And these stories are what are going to connect us together to be able to move forward in terms of climate injustice, social injustice, borders, and the need to move forward, basically, in our lives. So finally, coming back to the image I started with, environmental justice is our cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions that threaten to submerge our homes, has more reality to it than what we saw in the beginning, because the toxins are not only in the environment as chemicals, as toxins, but also within our own selves, as we see borders to be borders and not pathways to connecting to people. The toxins are also present in the form of capitalism that manifests itself as greed, as being competitive, as showing us that we have to fight for resources when it could be abundant, when we could make it abundant. And these toxins are affecting the people that are already more vulnerable and creating barriers between all of us. So to be able to see a life that could flourish, forests that could grow, we have to know and learn what it is to be human, to be able to connect to one another at levels that don't justify why we need to help someone, why we need to cross a certain barrier when we have deadlines, but to be able to make space even for the smallest connections that take people a step forward, because we just never know when one connection can make many other connections to make more people possible in this world. And the last thing I'm going to say is that the worst thing we can do as humans is to make other people feel that like they're lonely, that we cannot give the possibility of reliance on ourselves, right? And a huge part of the world depends on this, depends on the harmony of all of us and our connection with the nature and beings all across borders and our immediate community. Okay, so that was the end of it.
Thank you so much, Nidhi. Do you want to stop sharing your screen if you can? Yeah, thank you. Let's all give Nidhi a round of Zoom applause or a reaction. I am feeling so inspired. Thank you so much for sharing your stories, your wisdom, bringing in art. And I think you just took a huge, huge, huge subject that I think could take multiple PhDs to unpack and still have more to learn, and made it tangible for all of us. And I really appreciate you sharing with us. So thank you. So yeah, let's move into a time of Q&A. Feel free to type your questions into the chat and I will ask them verbally, and you're also welcome to unmute yourself and ask your question verbally if you'd like to do that. So the floor is anyone's. I see a hand with Gabe and Teresa. You can go ahead and ask your question if you'd like.
Niddy, we're really grateful for what we saw tonight, and especially the gentle way that you talk about really difficult issues, racism, capitalism, climate crisis. And I wonder, what is your sense of hope as you start a new phase of PhD study or continued study in botany? What is your sense of hope in the face of all this?
Yeah, wow. Thank you, Teresa, for that question. I do also want to say that the topics I covered are so vast and generalized almost, right? It's more intricate. But what I do want to do is to be able to be that person to where people can rely on in terms of education. I want to be able to change education. Education is a basic about our world and ourselves. We are empowered to change our world around the world around us. So I want to make that possible for everyone across the world. And I also want to study plants and spread the knowledge of plants through scientific findings. So all of us can learn more about the mystery of how beautiful plants are in this world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions for Nidhi?
I tend to work in communities, small communities around me, community gardens, small churches, and I'm not encountering people that are very different than myself. So how you talked about an individual, I see communities as sort of the salvation of the world, and that if I know my neighbors and we're all taking care of each other, there's a balance within that community. And if everybody had a community, they could take care of each other. How do I integrate that with people in other countries and thousands of miles away?
Yeah, Melissa, that's a great question. I think that one thing that comes to my mind is the way of integration being the possibility to connect across borders, right? And what I mean by this is to approach with curiosity, to approach with questions and curiosity and learning, even when people in the US can move all across the world with the visas with the passports that we all have, right? But how we connect with the people that are in different countries depends on how we approach this connection. Are we going to connect through curiosity and learning and wanting to learn lessons? Or are we going to connect with having to bring something already that we have? And there could be connections in both ways, but one thing I have learned is when we approach people with curiosity, we build in a stronger sense of connection and reliance on one another, because we're coming at the most basic point. So that is one perspective that I have and would like to contribute. But maybe other people in this group have other perspectives, like my sister or anyone else. Don't want to put anyone on the spot.
Maybe while people are considering how to respond to that, another question came in through the chat that I'll ask you as well, Nidhi. From Amelia, how do you see biking as part of the transition in self and society that you're talking about?
Bicycling, Amelia. I don't have a car really, so my only way of transportation is biking. If all of us could bike, then I would probably meet more people, for sure. But we also do need public transportation to go long distances from where I am to my PhD in LA. So biking is a very good short-term possibility to connect with people, but we also need public transportation.
Maybe have time for one or two more questions that anyone might have. I see a hand raised. Perry, if you want to ask a question, you're welcome to.
Oh, I just had a thought in response to what Melissa was asking, and then I also would be curious for Nidhi's reaction as well. But thinking about the work of building community in place, wherever the place happens to be that we are, I think there's and then the dilemma of how to connect across scales to something that seems so huge and so cross-cutting, like climate justice. I think if we also think across time, there's a question of what kind of groundwork are we laying in the community building that we're doing, and that through the next decades, we're just at the beginnings of these disruptions that are going to become more and more profound. And so in the work wherever we are that we're doing with communities wherever we are we building a groundwork that's open and that can help to support people in an ongoing kind of way as people are having to move? And then I guess turning that into a question, I wonder for Nidhi, thinking of the pressingness of those long-term changes, what feels like the most urgent thing to be paying attention to right now?
Nidhi, I think you're muted.
Sorry. I think whatever I'm going to answer is going to be a little more diverse in its own way, in that it's hard to pay attention to one thing as so many people, right? As people having so many skills and so many abilities to change their own environment. So it's hard to just linear in to this smaller focus and to change that. But I do want to say that by growing as people, by growing our own strengths, by growing as individuals in our whatever we're doing and getting closer with conscience and work like bringing work and our conscience together and bringing them closer will enable other people to reach out to us. And when they do, we have the possibility of creating different changes rather than just one, is my perspective from where I'm coming, because I think so many people have amazing skills and they should continue to build those and support the people that are interested in building those. And that way we have more tentacles going out in different directions, doing important work than doing one work as all individuals.
We have one more question in the chat and then we'll close this Q&A time up. Peter Smith says, I was struck by a phrase you used a couple of times in your presentation, entanglement with the land. It seemed you often associated this descriptor with poor farmers, but it got me thinking about how capitalism and maybe global travel trains us to think of ourselves as separate from the land, a fundamental lie. Might a healing of alienation from the land dovetail with healing alienations among various divided people groups? Or maybe you could reflect more on that phrase, entanglement with the land.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for pointing that out. I also want to acknowledge that the idea of poor farmers was not always poor in the sense that we consider farmers to be poor, right? And entanglement with the land, what I mean by that is from my own perspective, but not a generalized perspective. And I don't want to speak on the behalf of other people, but what I meant is a deeper connection in not knowing the separation between your immediate environment and that which you work in. Like our connection, my connection with the land growing up, my grandmother made oils and we spoke about plants. And when I was stressed, my mother or grandmother would say, go look at the green plants outside or the blue sky. So you see that it wasn't entirely like two category of things, but rather entangled in the way of living. And what I saw in some of the people's lives when I traveled was also this large entanglement of not being able to concretely separate them as two separate things, because work and private life is life, right, in so many places. So that's what I mean. But capitalism does play a huge role, and that's why I decided to incorporate that in my presentation, that we cannot talk about these concepts without acknowledging the big elephant in the room, which is capitalism that changes so many dynamics, right? It's not always the case that people are entangled with the land. It's not always the same story. They're different stories and they give a different sense of perspective. And I don't want to generalize that, but with the current situation, we do see that we need money. I need money to be able to move forward, and farmers need money to be able to buy equipment, and capitalism plays a huge role in that. We have to just learn how to support each other as humans, how to move forward in becoming better at what we are doing, right?
Thank you so much, Nidhi, and thank you to, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, if other people want to add to any of these thoughts, you're welcome to. Just want to say that.
We can also maybe do that a little bit in the breakout rooms. I just want to be mindful of the folks' time who may need to hop off this call. But let's give Nidhi another Zoom style round of applause for her amazing words and reflections that she shared this evening. So before everybody starts heading off this call, for those of you who might not join or stick around for the breakout rooms, I just want to give a quick plug for next week's session. Will also be happening on a Thursday on the 18th. So a week from today, also at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Sherry Hostetler, who's a pastor at First Mennonite Church of San Francisco, is going to be sharing, and she has titled her session, How the Past Has Shaped Our Present Moment, Understanding the Doctrine of Discovery and its Impact on Indigenous People and Creation. So I'm very excited for that.